Future Warrior, The Mars Campaign, Chapter 10. Further to the east, the last UEAF Dark Star pilot pulled his ejection handle and was thrown from his multi-million-dollar stealth fighter at 12 Gs. He had expended all his missiles and cannon ammunition, and having reached bingo fuel and being swarmed by over a dozen enemy fighters, he finally decided to eject. He had done his best. At the ridge, the roar of fire and the thud of impacts were now constant, and Stalker lay in his foxhole, shooting short controlled bursts at infantry that were moving up the slope using IFVs and APCs for cover. All the meanwhile, getting covered by a constant rain of red earth and dust. Stalker knew he had to take out those IFVs before they got within range to use their flamethrowers, and he put 350mm heat grenades into the nearest vehicle, stopping it and forcing the following infantry to scatter as it caught fire. In response, bullets began kicking up ground around his foxhole. Stalker searched for the source and spotted a heavy machine gun team that had just set up to his left. Quickly taking aim, Stalker squeezed off several shots, cutting down both of the Reds manning it, before putting a few carefully aimed rounds into the weapon itself, destroying it. Stalker stole a glance of the wider battlefront. The terrain offered little or no cover to the attacking Red Legion armor and mechanized infantry. The problem was it also offered little more than token cover to the defenders as well. The valley was filled with hundreds of smoke plumes from destroyed vehicles, while the ridgeline was also blemished with rising columns of acrid black smoke. Missile fire from the defenders was beginning to slow as anti-tank teams ran out of ammunition, and anti-tank vehicles were identified by the attacking Red forces and destroyed. Stalker glanced at the time in the corner of his HUD. They had only been engaged for 30 minutes, and the enemy, despite taking heavy losses, was about to directly assault the lines. As the Red Legion forces reached the edge of Grenade range, the dull thud of grenades joined the tempest of noise. Using the longer range of his M503, Stalker lobbed a couple of frag rounds behind an oncoming Warthog, sending men scattering, before quickly changing grenade magazines and putting 2 heat rounds into the APC, halting it. The Warthog's turret gunner opened up with a 20mm cannon, and Stalker rolled out of his foxhole as it was strafed by the heavy rounds. Lying prone, Stalker emptied his rifle's magazine into the turret, the 12mm explosive rounds peppering the armor, a couple of rounds penetrating the thin armor and killing the gunner. With a loud hurrah, the Red infantry all along the line stormed the dug in UEDF positions. Stalker saw a dozen Reds charge him, their rifles firing from the hip as they ran. With no time to reload, Stalker fired a 50mm heat grenade into the first onrushing man. And although it didn't detonate, due to the grenade's safety proximity arming fuse, it still packed a punch and sent the Red face first into the dust. Just as Stalker went to draw his close combat weapons, feeling incoming rounds begin to hammer on his EEA, a long burst of fire from his left cut down the charging Red platoon in spectacular fashion, filling the air with red mist and flying body parts. Spinning around to see the source, Stalker saw one of the new Terra Nova men kneeling by his foxhole, smoking impulse rifle in hand. "I thought you could use a hand. I had it under control." The man gave him a mock salute. "Seemed that way to me, specialist." Stalker looked around. All along the defensive line, bitter hand-to-hand combat was taking place, and slowly but surely the UEDF troops were losing. The Reds were keeping their heavy armor back down in the valley for Overwatch, and were assaulting the line with a seemingly unlimited number of mechanized infantry. Almost all of the UEDF supporting vehicles had now been destroyed, and the infantry were running out of anti-tank weapons. Alpha Epsilon 2-1, this is Bravo Epsilon, you copy? Over the sound of firing on the comm, Net Stalker heard D's reply. "Roger Bravo, what's your sit rep? We're about to lose the line. We have to redeploy." He said redeploy as opposed to retreat because the Terra Nova never retreated, although sometimes a tactical withdrawal was prudent. There was a pause. "Roger that. The other commanders concur. We will redeploy to the second line on crest of the ridge. All units, this is Alpha Epsilon, Vesper, repeat Vesper." With the withdraw code given, Stalker quickly scooped up the remaining ammo and 2 remaining slap launchers around his foxhole, popped a smoke grenade, and began to fall back. All along the line, he could see others doing the same. Because of the continuing pressure from the Reds, it was a fighting withdrawal, men falling back a short distance at a time, and then stopping to return fire at the onrushing enemy at every opportunity. As he moved up the slope, Stalker left the burning hulks of 2 enemy vehicles and a score of dead infantry behind him. Further up the slope, he came upon several infantry, which rallied to his black armored figure, joining him in falling back. Stopping and using the wreckage of a destroyed LTT for cover, Stalker quickly shouldered one of his slap launchers and hit an onrushing Ironhide, smoke issuing from the impact point as the vehicle clattered to a halt. Dropping the empty launcher, Stalker shouldered his rifle and fired a burst at a group of red figures that were emerging through the smoke haze further down the slope. The burst went high, and the Reds dropped out of sight as they took cover. Stalker took the chance, and waving the others to follow, and quickly withdrew. Reaching the top, they dropped prone in a rough skirmish line alongside the scattered foxholes of the mechanized infantry that made up the second line, Stalker ending up next to a mechanized infantry soldier and the new Terra Nova recruit who had saved him earlier. Red infantry were now crawling up the slope through the haze of smoke and remnants of the crushed crop, an intense firefight rapidly flaring up all along the line. Stalker set a frag grenade to 3 seconds and lobbed it down the slope. At the same moment, a grenade landed near him and exploded. The force shoved him bodily over, and it took Stalker a moment to realize what had happened. As he struggled to focus, Stalker realized that his vision was impaired. Unconsciously, he brought up his hand and wiped his helmet's visor to clear it. It came away red with blood. For a moment, Stalker thought he had been hit, but his suit's integrity readout was still green, indicating that his suit had not been penetrated. Stalker looked at the other Terra Nova man. He was still firing. Looking the other way, Stalker saw the remains of the infantry soldier. The man had been ripped to shreds by the blast. Stalker knew he was shell-shocked and tried to focus. He looked for his weapon and found that it was on the ground in front of him. Except for a few scratches, it seemed okay, and he picked it up. The digital ammo counter read 29. Stalker shouldered it, and it quickly began to squeeze off rounds down the slope to keep the Reds pinned. With a sonic boom, an F-50 Moon Blazer tore over the front and dropped a number of canisters. As they tumbled to the ground, they expelled a cloud of gas. Just before striking the ground, the air-fuel bombs ignited the gas cloud with a stupendous fireball and shocking blast. As he rolled off the crest to avoid the rolling ball of flames, Stalker saw the F-50 go vertical, a wickedly fast missile rising in pursuit, the missile striking the jet's left wing and disintegrating it. The missile came from some distance off, and Stalker impulsively looked for the source and saw to his surprise and relief advancing columns of armored vehicles. The ground convoy from Warlock had arrived. Others, too, had seen them, and the thin line of survivors on the ridge gained new hope, and they redoubled their fire. There was a sudden terrific blue flash, and the ground to Stalker's left sizzled. The red earth itself melted. Looking around furiously for the culprit, Stalker found it in the massive form of an assassin tank. Shouldering the last slap launcher Stalker let fly, it flew true and struck the tank's slope turret, but the assassin shrugged off the hit and rolled on, its advanced armor barely scarred. All along the line, Devastators and assassin tanks emerged through the smoke and wreckage. The ridge was lost. Redeploy to the rear. All units fall back now, came Big D's voice over the commnet, and all along the line the battered remnants of the defenders withdrew, red armor and infantry hot on their heels. As he jogged down the reverse slope, Stalker threw some glances around him in both directions, and couldn't help but notice how few men he could see falling back, so few from the thousands that had landed only hours before. The columns from Warlock had now begun to deploy into the fields on the reverse side of the ridgeline into their makeshift battle groups. A mix of scarred APCs and IFVs mixed in with a precious few tanks and scout vehicles. To the rear of these makeshift units were a number of MADs with turrets tracking and radar spinning. The few remaining gunships had taken position behind the deploying armor to provide overwatch, and as the first Red Legion tanks rolled over the crest, the gunships loosed the last of their heavy Hellstrike anti-tank missiles. One Devastator was struck by a Hellstrike missile and AL-66 cannon rounds simultaneously. Its massive tracks were blown clean off, and the 90-ton vehicle was physically lifted a few feet off the ground before coming back to Earth with a crunch, thoroughly wrecked. But the turn of the tide was short-lived as more and more tanks, armor, and infantry poured over the ridge, their superior numbers and firepower beginning to tell. The Reds had committed some of their heavy armor divisions to crush the stubborn resistance on the ridge after the initial assault by mechanized units had been held up by the scratch UEDF forces. The UEDF was trying desperately to buy time by delaying fresh heavy divisions with worn-out and green mechanized divisions. It was working, but only just and at great cost. The Red advance was being slowed, but not by much. The UEDF scratch forces were now at the breaking point. From behind the raging battle lines, the man in overall command monitored the situation from the commander's console of his Paladin pattern mech. It was over. It would have to be enough. Calmly, he activated the TACnet. Blue streak, blue streak, blue streak. The code commands served dual functions. The first was the complete withdrawal of the blocking forces, or more accurately, what remained of them. The second was it signaled the designated rearguard unit to move in and cover the withdrawing forces, which in this case is unit, the 521st Mech Battalion, the Blue Sabres. On the battlefield, Stalker was down to 2 frag grenades, 3 magazines for his impulse rifle, 1 50mm heat grenade, and was surrounded by burning vehicles and dead soldiers. With a makeshift squad of men who had rallied around him, he had been falling back from destroyed vehicle to destroyed vehicle, taking losses and being pushed back by the seemingly endless numbers of Red infantry and armored vehicles. He was nursing a shoulder wound from some unknown large-caliber round that had fractured his ceramic shoulder plate. Stalker knew it wasn't critical, but it hurt like hell when he shouldered and fired his rifle, not something he had been able to avoid during the continuing delaying action. The TACnet crackled. Blue streak, blue streak, blue streak. Stalker tapped the shoulder of the man next to him who withdrew. Then, throwing a grenade, he too ran, others doing the same. They ran to a Warthog APC that was slowly reversing while spraying cannon fire at the crest and began a board. There was now so much smoke and dust that Stalker had gone back to IR to try to see the enemy. Stalker walked backwards alongside the APC, covering the others while they got on board. He was determined to be the last man to leave the field. Through the dust and smoke, Stalker saw the large shape of a Devastator tank passing on the left, but couldn't see whose it was. As he watched, the tank halted and its turret swung towards them. Oh shit, it was a Red Legion tank, and it had seen them. Stalker's breath caught in his throat. Then something massive landed in front of him, blocking the image of the tank. Stalker quickly switched from IR back to standard image enhancement and saw to his surprise the bulk of a massive blue and gray mech standing before him. It looked like a giant gladiator. The mech was facing the Devastator, and it brought down one of its arms from which extended a laser sword, the brilliant blue blade of pure energy slicing clean through the tank's barrel. The mech then brought an armored foot forward and kicked the 90-ton tank on its side before lowering a heavy short railgun and putting a few rounds through its exposed hull. The mech then boosted into the sky and, hovering for a moment, loosed a cluster of 12 missiles from its shoulder pods, the missiles going in all directions, each seeking a different target. With a burst from a side-mounted ion thruster, it jerked bodily to the left, and a missile flew past, narrowly missing the hovering mech. In response, the mech raised its railgun and loosed a couple of quick shots before boosting forward out of sight. Stalker had seen mechs in action only rarely before, but could tell that the crew of this machine were true aces. Still slightly in awe, Stalker boarded the Warthog and slid the door closed behind him with a clang. The Warthog now took off, and Stalker was thrown around on the floor, its metal washing machine-like interior filled with blood, spent bullet linkages, and worn-out men. As he was knocked about, Stalker wondered where Big D was. He hadn't seen or heard from him since the withdrawal from the ridge. The retreat was chaotic. All along the line, armored vehicles and men withdrew in confusion. Stalker picked himself up from the Warthog's floor and managed to climb up to open a top hatch to get a view of what was going on as the Warthog continued to lurch along the bumpy ground through a field. There were other vehicles cutting paths through the fields to the left and right, and Stalker couldn't help but note how similar this withdrawal looked to a route. As he looked back to the smoking slope they had just left, Stalker saw an amazing sight. There were at least a dozen mechs working in pairs along the ridgeline, holding back the masses of red vehicles. They moved in great jumping leaps. Bright blue laser swords flashed in the dust and smoke, and missiles and tracers filled the air, chasing them as they moved amongst the vehicles. Enemy vehicles were sent rolling or crushed as the mechs walked and jumped through the armored formations. Stalker watched one mech boost upwards, the blast effect from its ion boosters tipping over several vehicles, before it then skillfully sprayed autocannon fire into the upturned hulls. Without warning, a massive green bolt of energy came seemingly from nowhere and struck the mech dead center. As Stalker watched open-mouthed, the blue saber mech exploded, the twisted wreckage falling to the ground. After a moment of disbelief, Stalker saw the source of the blast. On the opposite side of the valley was a massive red mech. It was not like any he had ever seen. It was bipedal with rear-facing jointed legs. Its main body wasn't the usual angled slabs of armor, but instead was smooth and curved. Its two arms hung just lower than the level of the body and didn't grasp weapons. Instead, they ended in massive square-shaped pods. But the behemoth's most striking feature was mounted on its back and extended over the top of its body, a single massive pulse cannon, which to Stalker looked like it could have put a hole in the world. "My God," he said aloud to himself, "they have a Goliath." As he watched, still jerked around by the motion of the warthog, Stalker saw the Goliath swivel slightly and extend one of its arms. A huge missile exploded from the top right of the pod, and with a flash accelerated with blinding speed, heading for another of the blue saber mech. The mech detected the incoming projectile and began to jink and fire decoys in an effort to evade the missile. But as the missile closed, its nose cone disintegrated and it split into 8 smaller missiles. Stalker recognized the design. It was a massive multiple warhead cluster missile, no doubt designed to kill mechs. Several of the smaller missiles penetrated the mech's active and passive defenses, striking the blue-gray mech and tearing it pieces, its advanced armor being no match for the brute force of so much firepower. Other blue saber mechs responded, and several rail shots lanced out and struck the Goliath. But even from this distance, Stalker could see the shots ricochet off the Goliath's armor, weakened by its energy dispersion shields, leaving small dark scars on the Goliath's dirty red exterior. Enemy mechs now began to appear across the valley and added their fire to the Goliaths. As the warthog sped over a low rise and into a wide sweeping valley leading back to FOB, Warlock Stalker finally lost his view of battlefield. As he did, the last thing he saw was remaining blue saber mechs charge the enemy, with one which looked very much like the one that had saved him, getting struck by the Goliath's pulse cannon and going spinning to the ground. Something told Stalker he wouldn't be seeing them again. The beautiful blue-gray mechs of the 521st Mech Battalion, the Blue Sabers, were writing themselves a glorious epitaph in UEDF history, giving their lives to hold back the red tide. As they slipped from sight, and despite everything that had happened, Stalker took a moment to say a short prayer to whatever god or gods were out there for the men and women of the Blue Sabers. They were truly warriors worthy of remembrance. As the sounds of battle began to diminish, Stalker hoped that TACCOM had their shit together and had support heading their way, or all they would find at FOB's Warlock and Centurion would be the smoking ruins of the bases and their slain defenders. As he was bumped around deep in thought in the back of the Warthog, Stalker heard a crackling voice over the commnet. "All Terra Nova en route to FOB Warlock rally at the antenna farm. Repeat, all Terra Nova en route to FOB Warlock rally at the antenna farm." The message then repeated itself, requesting Excalibur and then Praetorian members. Stalker listened closely. That sounded like Big D. Stalker cursed that his comm net wasn't working thanks to a piece of shrapnel that had hit his helmet. He could receive but not send communications on either the comm or TAC nets. The antenna farm was UEDF slang for the base control tower, and as they approached the base, Stalker once again climbed through the top hatch to get a better look. It was immediately clear, even from several kilometers out, that they weren't the first ones to visit the base recently. Rising into the red-tinged sky were columns of smoke from burning buildings, and as they rolled through a perimeter gate, Stalker saw the burning wreckage of a fighter bomber, its red tail still visible in the smoking pyre. Stalker directed the driver of the Warthog to head for the base control tower, and saw as he approached a crowd of black, purple, and white armored figures intermixed with a larger number of SBA uniforms. The control tower itself was a smoking ruin. Amongst the assembly of tattered and dusty-looking soldiers, Stalker saw one particularly scarred-looking individual dressed in black EEA who gave him a wave. The Warthog rolled to a stop, shutting down its engine to conserve fuel since it looked like the base-ready access reserves had taken a hit. Taking off his helmet, Stalker walked up to Big D and threw him a mock salute, which D returned. "You still alive, Specialist?" Stalker looked him up and down. "Damn, you're ugly." They both laughed and shook hands. "I've got someone I want you to meet, Stalker. This is Jovinus of the Praetorians." Stalker grinned as he looked at the purple armored Praetorian next to Big D. "We've met." And he shook his hand. "Fancy meeting you here. Seems like trouble follows you Terra Nova guys around." "Hell no, we follow it around. It keeps us on our toes. What brings you here, Jovinus?" "You run out of Reds at Tharsis. Someone had to save your friend's arse. I found him trying to commit suicide against a Red Devastator back on the ridge." He just nodded, also grinning. "Took 3 of us to carry the heavy bastard kicking and screaming from the battle. Then we had to explain suicide was against UEDF regulations." There was another round of laughter at that. A grim-looking white-armored Excalibur soldier walked up to the small gathering. "Jovinus D, everyone's here that made it, and time is short." Both nodded, and they moved towards the main gathering. By now, there seemed to be several hundred assault troops there, and perhaps double that many from the regular infantry. As the hastily organized TAC meeting began, Stalker noticed a young infantry soldier with 312th Infantry patches standing close. He didn't even look old enough to shave. "Hey son, where's your unit?" He looked at Stalker, seeming a little dazed. "PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder." Stalker thought he had seen it before. "They're dead or missing mostly, sir. I mean, Specialist." Stalker looked at him, not knowing what to say. The boy had probably just seen all of his friends from basic training die. "The Reds drove through us, and their mechs cut us up as we withdrew. Some Excalibur men saved my life and got me out of there. I decided then if I'm going to die, I'm going to die alongside the best, sir. You're not dead yet, son. And if it is your time, take as many of those red bastard with you as you can." The infantryman swallowed a muffled reply, and Stalker saw his grip on his IW-30 tighten. Stalker listened to the rest of the impromptu meeting and even managed to dredge up a spare helmet that fit from a wounded Terra Nova soldier who wouldn't need it where he was going. Yet another reason to give the Reds some well-earned payback, Stalker thought, as he tested his new helmet systems. It turned out that all of the UEA infantry gathered at the ruined control tower had been part of scratch units that had fought alongside the assault troops, or had been saved by them. Stalker guessed a lot of them figured that this was the safest place to be. The surviving mechanized forces had begun to dig in around the base perimeter, and everywhere vehicles and men scurried about pilfering what ammunition and supplies could still be found on the base to replenish their exhausted stocks. The new defensive line stretched over 50 kilometers in length from FOB Warlock to FOB Centurion, but it was pathetically weak in the center, and almost none of the already scarce heavy armor had made it back to either base. There had also been no communications from the Blue Sabres since the withdrawal, and they were assumed lost. It was decided by the ad hoc commanders that due to the terrain, they would concentrate the remaining assault forces where the hammer would likely fall the hardest, the plains before Warlock. Centurion had slightly better defensive terrain and was closer to the axis of the Red Legion advance. It therefore made sense that the Reds would land a heavier blow on Warlock before completing a pincer movement and encircling Centurion and the defensive line, creating a pocket that could then be liquidated. With this in mind, the scant remaining assault troops would form a defense and attempt to hold Warlock and the left flank. There is still no word from TACCOM on reinforcements, and long-range TACnet communications were being heavily jammed, making it was impossible to get a message out. It was, however, possible to receive some scattered and often fragmented parts of the communications traffic, while fortunately the local comnets, due to their localized encrypted LAN design, were unaffected by atmospheric jamming. The meeting broke up and the assault and infantry troops, now numbering around 2,000 and all moved out, boarding an assortment of APCs, IFVs, and transport vehicles. No one knew how long they had before the Reds attacked the defensive perimeter, but so far recon elements positioned further out had reported no contact with the enemy. As the APC rolled to a halt next to a small rocky outcrop, Stalker exited and began issuing orders to the exhaust infantry, who had been left virtually without officers to lead them following the early engagements. He had to get them coordinated, and after a few swift words, everyone started digging in and clearing their fire zones. A group of Praetorian soldiers, Jovinus amongst them, set up on a nearby rocky outcrop with a couple of Cobra anti-tank missiles and an autocannon. D joined Stalker in organizing the defenses. They were establishing a smaller and hence denser defensive position and would position themselves in the shape of a wedge with the rocky outcrop being the tip. The idea being to let the enemy armor break on the tip and be exposed to flanking fire on their weaker side armor as they passed. It was good in theory, but Stalker knew it left them exposed in relatively open terrain if the enemy decided to encircle them, as the plan counted on the Reds going hell for leather for the base at the expense of all else. But considering the relative ease with which the Reds had pushed them back earlier, Stalker thought there was a good chance that the Reds would commit to another frontal assault. They had been digging in for around 20 minutes when the call came that enemy mechanized units had been sighted and were probing in the direction of Warlock. Shortly after, some very dusty-looking recon infantry approached on Dune Rider trail bikes and stopped, chatting briefly to an Excalibur soldier who hailed them down. They then sped off to the far left with orders to keep their eyes open for any wider flanking attempt. But this was unlikely, Stalker thought. Not only would the Reds be confident of an easy victory, they were also in a rush to secure the bases before the UEDF could react fully, and it was doubtful they would waste the time to flank that wide. The enemy's strength was still estimated at 3 to 4 corps plus support and independent elements. They had been hit by perhaps a full corps along the ridgeline earlier, and had managed to inflict substantial losses before being pushed back. That still left 2 to 3 full heavy corps that remained as yet unengaged. And despite the appearance of the Goliath and some mechs, they all knew that the Reds must still have more mechs in reserve. The empty bays at the Mars Corps base held more than the few dozen they had seen at the ridge. Before the defenses stretched a vast plain which ended with low hills in the far distance, all of it covered by a patchwork quilt of crops, now crisscrossed by the paths made by the retreating UDF, the crops having all but been ruined as they were trampled under the weight of the retreating armored vehicles. As he watched from the now silent battle line, Stalker began to be able to pick out the shapes of Red Legion recon vehicles coming over the low sloping hills. Several missiles stretched out to meet them, covering the distance quickly with the blistering speed of their scramjet engines, and the horizon was soon decorated with a number of columns of smoke from burning vehicles, the secondary explosions eerily quiet from so far away. Soon the large, squat shapes of tanks also appeared, leading columns of APCs and IFVs. These too were engaged, but the limited supply of long-range missiles soon ran dry, and they came on unopposed. All along the line, the thud of explosions and pillars of red earth thrown skyward marked the Red Legion artillery's entry into the battle. Indeed, the muzzle flashes of the enemy's self-propelled artillery could be seen just over the distant low hills. The Red Legion armored spearheads had now descended onto the plain itself and quickly deployed into wide formations. The Red units were advancing at speed, throwing up great plumes of red dust behind them, their numbers seeming limitless. They had a lot of open plain to cover before they reached the defenders' lines, and against well-equipped fresh troops, they would have taken murderous fire, but the defenders simply had nothing left to throw at them. The few autocannons, missiles, RPGs, and other heavy weapons they had left wouldn't be effective until the Reds were much closer. Stalker looked at his impulse rifle until you could see the whites of their eyes. Through the dust rising above the enemy juggernaut came a low-flying formation of F-50 Moon Blazers. They split up and tore overhead. Several SAMs rose up and destroyed a pair of them before a hailstorm of anti-radiation missiles quickly silenced the few remaining air defenses. With air superiority, established precision, guided missiles, and cluster bombs began to rain down on the UEDF defenders. Stalker watched fuel air bombs come down on the lines to his right, stretching back towards the base, and wondered how many good men had just died in the swirling clouds of dust and flame. 3 bombers circled around once again, and this time headed straight for Stalker's position. He saw them coming, and it was like the footsteps of doom approaching. As they came closer, Stalker tried to flatten himself in his foxhole. This is going to be unpleasant. As he watched the trio of planes approaching, something surreal happened. All 3 jerked violently away, and then one after another exploded, fiery debris raining down onto the green fields. Stalker lay in his foxhole, not comprehending what had just happened. With a loud boom, a flight of F-55 Dark Stars roared over the lines and burned over the advancing Red Legion formations, dropping cluster bombs in their wake. The ground shuddered at their impacts, and it seemed as if God himself had reached down and dropped a little piece of hell on the plains, as a wall of flame and dust rose skyward. The TAC net crackled, and through the interference, Stalker heard a voice. "Friendlies inbound from the west. Check fire. Check fire." Stalker rose up slightly, craning to look to his left and seeing a magnificent sight. Roaring at full speed across the plains, L-66 and plasma cannons blazing, was a long line of Devastator and Assassin tanks. All bore the fluttering blue flags of the 5th Armored Division. The 5th Armored, known as Old Faithful, had arrived on the field.